megalithic site of Sacsayhuaman in Peru is an incredible place. It sits almost broodingly over the equally ancient megalithic city of Cusco, high up in the South American Andes mountain range. The walls of Sacsayhuaman take your breath away when you first see them. They seem to challenge our perception of what was truly possible for our human ancestors. The gigantic polygonal masonry is formed from some truly massive individual blocks of limestone, some weighing well over 150 tons, and all of them so precisely shaped and fitted together that you can't fit a pin in between these stones. The complex joins and random shapes of the blocks render the wall effectively earthquake-proof, and building it would be a real challenge for any civilization, including our own. Although the Inca are credited with its construction, the history of Sacsayhuaman is shrouded in mystery and contradiction. There is significant evidence here to suggest that this site could be far older than the Inca civilization, and that they, rather than building this place, instead found it when they first arrived in this area. They repaired and renovated it, and they respected and utilized Sacsayhuaman in their ceremony and in their culture. My name is Ben, and you're watching Uncharted X. I hope you'll join me as we explore the astonishing ancient site of Sacsayhuaman, its history, its architecture, and the evidence that indicates that this site may be much older than we had ever thought, and that it may well be the megalithic remnants from a lost, ancient, and high-technology civilization. If you ask people to think of iconic South American megalithic sites, Machu Picchu is most likely the answer you're going to get. Now, there's no doubt that Machu Picchu is an amazingly beautiful and unique place. I've been there a few times, and I look forward to visiting it again someday soon. But the masonry work here is really dwarfed when compared to that of Sacsayhuaman. Many sites in the Sacred Valley share this unique polygonal style of masonry. We can find it at Ollantaytambo. We can find it in the streets of Cusco. It's at Pisac, and it's at many of the other amazing sites in Peru. And all of these walls are just as perfectly shaped and fitted together as the huge stones of Sacsayhuaman. But I can't help but feel like they are nothing but scale models when compared to these just epic walls. If ever there was a place said to have been made by giants, I think this would be it.
Yo, Tyler, what's up, man?
To me,
Thanks, buddy.
This is the most impressive site in all of South America, and it's one of the most enigmatic places on the planet.
What's up? Thank you.
There's lots to talk about when it comes to Sacsayhuaman, and it's also important to understand that there are plenty of unknowns. As with much of South America's ancient past, there really isn't a definitive answer when it comes to the true history of this place. I'm going to do this video in two parts because I know some of you will want to get right to the site review and skip all of the context and that type of thing. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the history of Sacsayhuaman. We're going to take a look at some of the evidence that it was once a continuous megalithic construction with Cusco that was likely here before the Inca ever arrived. And we're also going to take a good look at the Inca symbology that's used as proof that they built this place. And then in the second video that should come out in just a couple days after this one, we're going to take a good detailed look at all the areas of Sacsayhuaman, take a look at the architectural styles, the various features, and a few of the things that have been said about that place over the last several hundred years. I've been fortunate enough to have visited Sacsayhuaman several times over the past few years. It's a super easy site to get to. If you're in Cusco's central square, the Plaza de Armas, it's only a 10-minute cab ride away. The official archaeological site
thank you for following me, Jamie. Appreciate it. Hey, Jamie Pie. That's cool. 3.14159265.
In 2013, I
Jamie
was part
Pie,
of a
that's
small
cool.
group of people that were touring with Graham Hancock and Brian Forrester, and local author Jesus Gamara also joined us for a few days. This picture of Graham and I was taken at the top of Sacsayhuaman, and you can see how the site just looms over the city of Cusco.
Nice, weights and golden eye. Yo, yeah, for sure, dude.
Feet
Or do that, or Jamie.
2,500 meters above
For sure.
sea level, which can be quite an adjustment
Pretty much.
when you're first getting off the plane at the Cusco airport. If you
Lifting
ever
weights,
plan to
fortunately,
visit,
nice.
the altitude really is something to be aware of.
Oh,
If you've
nice,
not
buddy.
been over 10,000 feet
good.
before, you never really know
That's good,
if you're
man, yeah,
susceptible to
or
altitude
girl.
sickness or not until you
That's
first
great.
get there, and most people take a couple of days to adjust to it.
Yeah, I remembered Pi up to 3.141592.6. I didn't remember the 5. Now I remember the 5.
I typically do film a lot of it. For example, this is topping out the western breach of Kilimanjaro Mountain at just over 19,000 feet. I've been a little hesitant to cover topics outside of my main wheelhouse, but if you would ever like to see me make content on things like this Africa trip, please do let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. The proximity of Sacsayhuaman to Cusco isn't just a convenient coincidence for tourists. It's an important part of the site's history and legend. And
I like lifting and watching stuff like this, you know what I mean?
I suspect that
and streaming and chatting.
Of the same construction.
They wouldn't let me have a decimal point.
Cusco itself is a megalithic
nice.
city. It has many streets lined with some jaw-dropping megalithic architecture, and at its core lays the Coricancha, a huge and vastly ancient megalithic structure. Naturally, the Coricancha is a Catholic church today, upholding that particular institution's tradition of hijacking sacred places around the world and claiming them for itself. I will definitely take a closer look at these megalithic aspects of Cusco in future videos, but these older megalithic parts of the city seem to flow all the way up the hillside to Sacsayhuaman.
Pronouns.
A good example of this is Manco Capac's palace.
Boy's name, no worries. I've seen many different variations of Jamie in English and male and female.
The megalithic ruins of what is now known as San Cristobal's Church and Square.
So this is the original, probably construction Inca that Manco Capac had done. He was the first of the High Inca, so it's about 1,000 years old. But what you'll notice is the lintels, or the tops of each one of those niches, is linear. And it's actually a different material. It's basalt, so we can say automatically that the Inca found an abandoned site here that was megalithic in nature, and it was made out of basalt. And the basalt is from a quarry 50 kilometers that way.
Yeah, man.
Whereas all the andesite, which is the Inca construction,
I bought my equipment maybe 3 years ago, so I have it at home. So I've been doing it at home, which is nice. Because I don't have that heavy equipment. My equipment I could buy because it's not too much. Not too much weight.
Build my palace here because the ancient ones were here, and also I get to see Cusco.
I also like to work out and lift at random times, like
it's halfway between the
middle of the night and stuff.
There are still some original megalithic walls here that can be found. These are walls that were repaired by the Inca, all as part of Manco Capac's palace.
So you can see that's actually one man right there.
Oh, cool.
So originally Sacsayhuaman went from the top all the way down to the city. And that's why we find bits and pieces of it.
There are a couple of things to keep in mind about the palaces of the High Inca. First of all, there were only 11 High Inca, or 11 rulers, who reigned over the civilization before the Spanish turned up. And the whole civilization was barely 300 years old at that point. Each High Inca would not use the same palace as his predecessor. He would build his own palace in a different location in Cusco. Now, interestingly, it's only the first 7 of the High Inca palaces that contain any megalithic work in their construction at all. The remainder of the palaces up to the 11th High Inca were all built with little tiny stones, just small local stones. They were built with loose and the rough construction style. There wasn't any megalithic components in them whatsoever. How is this possible? According to our orthodox version of history, the Inca did all of the building work across all of their sites, including the megalithic stuff, in this very short few hundred years. There just isn't time to develop the astonishing capability to do this type of precision megalithic work, and then to lose it by the time the 8th High Inca comes into being. It just doesn't make any sense. It's very similar to the issues that I have with the Old Kingdom of Egypt, somehow just popping up out of the Stone Age and building everything we see at Giza, at Dashur, in Saqqara, and then somehow losing the capability to do this work.
This is obvious. Right. Underneath, this is basalt, again from a quarry 50 kilometers away. On top of it is Inca construction, because the Spanish knew what concrete was. As soon as they came here, they found sources of materials to make concrete, and so they would have used concrete. But the Inca, in this case, this may not have been super significant to the Inca. That's why they didn't do nice, tight work. But you have the difference. Andesite, local, basalt, from a great distance.
It makes much more sense if you consider the premise that the Inca found Cusco as an abandoned and destroyed megalithic city, and that each High Inca had megalithic courtyards rebuilt as their palace. And by the time the 8th High Inca rolled around, there were just no more megalithic structures left to rebuild, so they had to use the techniques they knew how to use, and they had to use the local stone. Now, I think this is one of the things that makes Cusco such a magical city. In my opinion, it's one of the oldest, and it's certainly one of the most unique cities on the planet. You have megalithic construction, Inca construction, colonial Spanish construction, and then you have modern architecture all blending together in the one place. I love spending time in Cusco exploring. You never really know what you might find. Brian Forrester first showed me these constructions at Manco Capac's palace in 2015, and these types of small pockets of what could only be considered truly megalithic work can be found all over Cusco.
Yeah. There's the Coricancha. Colonial Spanish with concrete. And then megalithic.
The remains of this megalithic wall happens to be just in the backyard of a small boutique hotel nestled in amongst the eucalyptus trees.
So this effect here on these two stones,
Yeah.
what's going on there? Is that just age, or are we talking about some kind of vitrification? Or?
We're talking the possibility that this is catastrophic damage. It's not damage from stones being on top of it, but our theory is that in Egypt and here, and in a few other parts of the world, that there was the civilization that did this work did so more than 12,000 years ago. The way we date that is the fact that there was a global catastrophe that happened approximately 12,000 years ago. It came from space. It could have been plasma ejection from the sun, according to Robert Schoch, or it could have been the emission of lethal energy from the center of our galaxy, which Paul de la Violette believes, who's a physicist. He believes that the center of our galaxy is not a black hole, but is a pulsar. So approximately every half precessional cycle, which is 13,000 years, more or less, it emits energy, which is lethal, which moves across the galactic plane, creating things like disturbing small planets, catching comets and altering their course. So it could be that a comet did this, and so there was, especially at high altitude as well, like here, that this disturbance was so profound that this could be the damage from that 12,000-year-old catastrophic event, which would have wiped out whoever was here.
Before we get into the history and details of Sacsayhuaman, let's step back a little and establish some context for the discussion. Firstly, when it comes to South America, we have to remember that there is much that we don't know, and much that we really can't ever know about the true history of this region. If there indeed was an ancient and advanced civilization living here at one point, existing thousands of years before the Inca, a civilization that built the incredible megalithic work, any record the Inca had of them was thoroughly destroyed by the Spanish in their quest for treasure and conquest. This destruction wasn't limited just to the Inca, it also happened to the Aztec and to the Maya cultures. The Catholic Church's ignorant savagery of the time was responsible for deliberately wiping out as much culture, knowledge, writings, and records from these civilizations as it possibly could. What they couldn't destroy, they tried to erase. The megalithic walls of the Coricancha were plastered over. Cusco itself was mostly burnt to the ground during the conquest, and they tried to destroy Sacsayhuaman as well, but they found that they weren't able to do much to these gigantic stones in the walls, thankfully. The site was then extensively quarried for building material when the Spanish occupied Cusco, and only the huge stones that couldn't be moved are what's left on the site today. I'd estimate that at best we're looking at around 1/3 of the original stonework that is still left on the site. We can only imagine the scale of this place in its original form, and many experts agree that the walls were at least 3 to 4 meters higher than they are today. Spanish chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega wrote in 1609 about the efforts of the Spanish at Sacsayhuaman. Quote, "To save themselves the expense, effort and delay with which the Indians worked the stone, they pulled down all the smooth masonry in the walls. There is indeed not a house in the city that has not been made of this stone, or at least the houses built by the Spaniards." End quote. The remains of Sacsayhuaman were then buried in soil to prevent the locals from drawing any strength from it. The site was more or less lost to history for a few hundred years, and modern excavations here only began again in around 1939.
UK, that's cool.
Just to forestall some of
I've
the
been to London before.
comments that
UK is a
I'll
cool
get
place.
that try to
I've seen
justify the
Stonehenge.
actions of the Spanish, I'm well
I saw
aware
Stonehenge
that
in
these
person. That was
South
really
American
cool.
cultures weren't perfect. I know that they were
I've been to London, been to
murderous and
Bath,
even
been to
destructive
Canterbury, been
themselves at
to
times, and that most of them ultimately died
Cambridge.
from
Really beautiful
disease
place.
rather than
England's
directly
amazing.
on the end of Spanish steel. All of that, however, is completely unrelated to the behaviour of the conquistadors and the behaviour of the frocked zealots in the church that were cheering them on. Two wrongs don't ever make a right, and nothing is a sufficient excuse for the destruction of not just entire civilizations, but also their accumulated knowledge in a deliberate attempt to rob all future generations of people, including you and me, of this precious information about our own past. Another contextual point that I want to make here is that this premise of an advanced ancient civilization existing prior to the Inca isn't some far-fetched idea or pseudoscience, which tends to be the label thrown at anything mainstream archaeology doesn't agree with. There is actually significant circumstantial evidence supporting this premise.
Oh, I had to push that
Much
one.
of it coming from the last few decades of scientific research. I'm referring specifically to the discoveries and research into the origins of the human species, and the discovery of the cataclysm and extinction level event that occurred at the end of the Pleistocene some 13,000 years ago. It's called the Younger Dryas Cataclysm. These discoveries should be having a major impact on history, and I've covered these topics in depth in several other videos, so I won't repeat myself here, but all of these videos are linked below. To understand the history and the debate over Sacsayhuaman, we also have to talk a little bit about Inca symbology. A commonly cited proof point that the Inca supposedly built both Cusco and Sacsayhuaman is that in Inca legend, the two sites are shaped like a giant puma, with Sacsayhuaman said to be the head of the puma, and megalithic Cusco forms the body. When seen from above, and with the right selective outline of the streets, it does indeed appear like a stylized puma. This shape isn't reflected in the names of the sites, however. In Quechua, the language of the Inca that is still spoken in this region today, the name Sacsayhuaman translates to place where the hawk is satiated, or satiated hawk. And Cusco, as the center of the Inca civilization, was also known as the navel of the world. But the word Cusco directly translates to Rock of the Owl. Yet, despite these names, the two are said to form the shape of a giant puma when seen from above. And this claim is often cited in literature and online as evidence that the Inca created these sites. This claim would seem to be contradictory to the premise of some unknown ancient civilization first building these sites, and then the Inca coming in much later and repairing them. But as with many aspects of these sites, it's just not that simple. And in my opinion, this so-called puma shape is not an indicator of anything much at all, and it's certainly not proof that the Inca first built this place. To understand why I say that, let's take a look at some other examples of this type of symbolic and spiritual connection that the Inca made to the physical world around them. See if you can spot the shapes on the Inca Roca wall here in Cusco. There's a snake representing the underworld, and then just a few paces down using some of the same blocks, there's a puma shape. These types of things are easy to find, and if you ever visit Peru, the guides will point many of them out to you. I showed several examples of this in my Napahuaca video. I'd recommend checking it out if you want to hear a little bit more about the Inca philosophy of Chicana, as told by a really awesome guide that we had when we were down there in Peru named Rogelio. He also pointed out different shapes that related to the Inca culture in the bluestone idol at Napahuaca.
Now, also, I have a shape here. Look at
That is the eye. It's actually a big puma head, yeah? Eye. That's little here corners, always three. That was part of the ear part. But it's missing, of course. You can see clearly. Yeah, eye. That's mean the mouth of puma. What is exactly the connection? And these two protuberance here means connection, and that's the teeth of puma.
Also shapes in the facing mountainside at Napohaka.
But also look at. Yeah, it's pointing to Cusco also here. Cusco is in the south part. All this mountain, so I see a face the front. So you see the big hole front? That is one of the eye. Yeah, the right eye. The left side is almost disappearing. The maxilla is almost covering, and you can see the big nose shaking us. Look.
We also find symbolic shapes at Alante Tamba. A condor is said to be represented in the shape of this hillside, this natural formation here. And Rogelio also explains here how he sees the shape of a puma in the giant megaliths at the top of Alante Tamba, and I have real difficulty kind of seeing what he's talking about here myself.
Parts of the bodies, pumas. Just probably the Spanish, they carry the head sparks. But you can see clearly the tail part, all the body, almost disappearing here. Look at the tail, look at the body, but the head was carried. We don't know exactly who made that.
These examples of symbolic shapes in megalithic architecture or even in natural formations could just go on and on. I've heard lots of different ones. Machu Picchu is supposed to be in the shape of a giant caiman, or it's in the shape of a giant condor. It depends on who you ask. The Huayna Picchu, the mountain that faces Machu Picchu, is supposed to have the face of a puma in it. And of course there is supposedly a puma paw in the wall at Sacsayhuaman. You may have noticed, but this process of identifying these abstract shapes seems to apply equally to both natural formations as well as to the megalithic architecture. And I think this is where we can start to see the problem with using this sort of subjective interpretation of random shapes as any proof of intent. A lot of the symbology here comes down to the eye of the beholder, and this is true for many such things. We as humans are designed to recognize patterns. We're very good at it, and whether you're looking at things like clouds or constellations, your mind can often find the shapes and patterns you're looking for in the randomness of nature. It almost happens unconsciously. In the case of the Inca, I'm sure that a little prompting from the priesthood wouldn't hurt either, much like we get a little prompting from the Orthodox historians and the modern-day guides that we'll find on these sites. Ask yourself, do you really see a puma shape here, or would you really see a puma shape here if you weren't already shown that it was there? I don't believe that these abstract patterns in megalithic architecture or the patterns that they find in natural hillsides are evidence that the Inca built these sites at all. It's really entirely subjective, but I think that the Inca just found the shapes they were looking for in the landscape and architecture. If you're always looking for snakes and pumas and condors, you're bound to find something that looks like that. It seems possible to me that they even constructed some of their mythology around these shapes. After all, they founded their civilization at Cusco, which was, in my opinion, a ruined megalithic city in the first place. Returning back to Sacsayhuaman and its alleged head of the puma shape, this is also something that's very abstract. This particular interpretation, this puma shape, is something of a sin of omission, as it leaves out many of the other megalithic areas and sites that are in the hills around Cusco, and I think these were probably all connected into the same site originally, and all of these sites were considered to be just as important as Sacsayhuaman. There's Kenko, there's the Temple of the Moon, there's Zone X, and there's many more just unnamed sites up and down these mountainsides, and you have to ignore all of them in order to see this puma shape. It's also a very selective use of the streets of Cusco itself. I bet that if you sat down with a piece of paper and a map, you could probably draw many different shapes by tracing various streets and alleyways of old Cusco. I looked for this for a long time, but I don't actually know the source for this claim that Cusco and Sacsayhuaman form a puma shape. It's entirely possible that it's a relatively modern claim given that you can only see it from above, and I don't think the Inca were known to be able to fly. I also want to be clear that I'm not dismissing the Inca philosophy or culture. It's remarkable on many levels, and their connection with spirit and to the natural world around them was both profound and poetic. This is something that you can still experience in traditional South American shamanism today. I'm also not saying that these shapes didn't mean something to the Inca. Clearly they did, they were very important. But between the inconsistent styles, the subjective and abstract nature of interpreting either megalithic architecture or natural mountainsides into these shapes, it's really hard to say that this is proof of intent. The funny thing is that the Inca themselves don't claim to have built Sacsayhuaman, although there's not really any consistent accounts of what they did say. In terms of most indigenous wisdom keepers, they'll tell you that the site was there before they got there. The other story that you'll hear is that the Inca said that it was built by giants and that it appeared overnight as if by magic. Even orthodox historians and archaeologists today don't really think that the Inca built this site or Cusco itself. They trace the origins of both Sacsayhuaman and Cusco back to the Quilchi culture, which apparently emerged some 300 or 400 years before the Inca, and they say that these guys were responsible for some of the initial building, but that the Inca built the vast majority of the architecture here. There is no real direct evidence that the Inca were even capable of this type of megalithic work, much less any real proof that they actually built these sites. On the contrary, there is plenty of evidence that suggests that they found these sites as abandoned megalithic, pre-existing sites, that they rebuilt and repaired them, that they respected them and eventually made them their own. The Inca civilization was built around these remains, and it seems to me that their mythology may well have been built around them as well. I hope you guys enjoyed that. It was part 1 of my Sacsayhuaman video. Part 2 should be out in a couple of days from now. Hopefully it'll be already available by the time you're watching this, and it'll be linked and suggested in this video. As always, I really want to thank everyone that does take the time to support this channel in whatever way that is. I very much appreciate it. It's the only way that I can get to make these videos. So if you like that idea, please do consider supporting the channel via the value for value model. You can find out all the ways to do that over at unchartedx.com/support. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace. This is Uncharted X, my name is Ben, and this is part 2 of my look into the enigmatic and mysterious megalithic site of Sacsayhuaman that sits just above Cusco in Peru. In the previous video, we took a look at the location of Sacsayhuaman and its relationship to Cusco, and also dug into some of the Incan symbology and the mythology that surrounds this site. In this video, part 2, we're going to focus on the architecture and take a guided tour around all of the different areas of Sacsayhuaman, including some of the areas that not many people take the time to go and see. We're going to look at the evidence for multiple styles of architecture on this site, and the idea that maybe the Inca, instead of building this site from scratch, instead found it as an abandoned megalithic ruin and then rebuilt the site. They used it, they respected it, and they integrated it into their culture. I am going to spend a minute to just set up the discussion about the architecture though, because fundamentally there are 3 different styles that we'll see across Sacsayhuaman, and indeed this is something you can see across many of the sites in the Sacred Valley, and we'll be referring back to these styles as we go along. If this is the first time you're hearing about these different styles, these different types of architecture in South American masonry, I do have a whole video on the topic. It talks about why I think a lot of the megalithic masonry that we see in particular is older than the actual Incan civilization, and you'll find a link to that below in the description. I do favour Jesus Gamarra's classification system. Both he and his father have been researching these sites and looking into these different types of architecture for more than 50 years. They published several books in Spanish. I've met Jesus on a couple of occasions. I have to say I'm not really into most of his theories, but in terms of his classification system, the way that he identifies the different types of architecture, it's one of those things that it just becomes elegantly simple after the fact. When you first realize it or you first really see it, your brain just goes, of course, and then it's something that you can't ever unsee. And in this case, it's when you realize there are these three architectural styles on these sites, it just all clicks into place. Fundamentally, there are three styles, and the oldest style is called Hanan Pacha, and this is the monolithic style. This is the carvings, the strange shapes that you see wrought into the hillsides itself. It's not, it's not all many blocks. There's only one piece usually. It's one part of the living rock itself. This always looks extremely eroded relative to other work. It's always at the bottom layer. You see on many of these sites, there's often other masonry built up on top of it. And it's at the center of a lot of these sites. To me, this is quite obviously, it just looks more ancient. Often you'll see it in a lot of disarray, as if there's been damage and destruction wrought on these sites. Then there's a second style, it's called Uran Pacha, and this is the classic South American megalithic style. It's the cellular walls, it's the multiple blocks, it's the super precise and very tightly joined walls that just are of an extremely high level of craftsmanship. This is the megalithic work, for want of a better term. Quite often it's made of a single type of stone. Usually it's stone that's had to have been moved in from the area. It's not always local stone. This work can also be vitrified or very shiny on the surface. We see this work everywhere. We see it in Cusco, Ollanta, Tambo. Obviously the zigzag walls of Sacsayhuaman are probably the best example. We'll be looking closely at those. There's quite clearly a third style that we see here. It's called Icun Pacha, and this is the Incan work. This is the loose stone walls. Sometimes there might be some mud mortar used in them, but it's the fairly primitive work that's been used and done to repair these sites. I think the Inca are responsible for all of this work. It's all of their terracing. I mean, they were prolific builders with this style. The Icun Pacha work is easily explainable by the Incas' capabilities. It's very much in line with the way that they built other things, with their artwork. It's not precise, but they were very prolific at it, and they were quite talented in some areas. But they just didn't have the capability to move around the types of stones that we're looking at in Sacsayhuaman, nor did they really have the capability to get to the level of precision that we see in this work. And really, God only knows who did the oldest work, the Hanan Pacha work. Some of that is just, it's so strange it's hard to even relate it to, like a human civilization. Christ, here we go. Man's talking aliens. I'm not talking aliens. So just a little bit of background on the different styles. So look out for these three different styles as we go around Sacsayhuaman. And we'll start that tour by looking at what is the most famous part of Sacsayhuaman, the zigzag walls. Typically when you get to this site, the taxi or the bus will take you to either one side or the other of this plaza, and right in front of you that just captures your attention is this incredible set of zigzag megalithic walls that extends up 5 terraces to the top of this mountain. We're going to get a good look at most of the areas of Sacsayhuaman here from a lot of different angles as we walk around. Some of these blocks are just insanely big. I mean, the scale is really hard to get to grips with until you actually go up and stand next to it, and you can get a sense for just how heavy and how large a lot of this masonry is. We don't really know exactly what's under the ground here. I know some of these blocks have been excavated and then been refilled in. Some of the bigger blocks do go down 12, even 15 feet. I think the tallest block on this site is nearly 30 feet tall from bottom to top, including what's in the ground. The estimates on these blocks, I think the most credible estimates put some of the largest ones at over 150 tons. I mean, just look at the size of some of these blocks. They're truly gigantic. But I've heard estimates as up to approximately 400 tons, which is probably pushing it a little bit, but certainly some of these are 150 tons or more. We're walking along the face of the wall here on the bottom level, and again, this site was buried in soil by the Spanish at one point. It's been excavated, and one of the interesting questions that you can think about is this actually the real ground level from when the excavation started? There's a lot of dirt, and we'll get a good look at some of the back sides of these walls and then what's on top of them. The other thing to remember is that all of the walls have been extensively quarried, and that most experts will tell you that they were at least 3 to 4 meters higher than what they are now. There are 5 courses when it comes to these zigzag walls, so there's different levels that go up. The biggest stuff is at the bottom, but there's some really huge stones that are also up in the higher courses, as well as at the other side of this courtyard area that stretches out in front of Sacsayhuaman. As we turn around, you'll actually see the other features of Sacsayhuaman. There's an entire hilltop. It's called the Rotadero. We'll talk more about that in a bit, that is a natural extrusion of lava, of rock, that rounded shape. But you also see megalithic walls, and it does qualify as Hanan Pacha because in many areas of that rocky hillside, we'll see a lot of carvings and shapes that have been put into that stone. I really love some of these shots. I use them quite a bit of the wall, and as we walk up close, as you see the so-called Puma's Paw, and we get a closer look at one of the bigger blocks that is on this site. This footage is actually walking from the other end of that same wall. We started over at one side and now we're at the other end. It's really interesting, and as we go further up, you'll see some of the masonry style change just a little bit. It's sort of less rounded and becomes more straight and more precise the higher up the mountain as we go. You can also see here the Inca construction clearly. You can obviously see the small work that the Inca have done to then repair what's happened on this site. I think that the Inca repaired megalithic work as best as they could. When you really look at these walls, you know, they're only going together in one particular way. It would be like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle. They really only fit in one spot. I wouldn't be surprised if the Inca actually repaired parts of this, because we see evidence for Inca repair work happening in many other megalithic sites. This also, I think, explains why in some cases you can see some megalithic sites that have some smaller stones sort of underneath them as foundations. You see this occasionally in a couple of places at Cusco, in the streets. You also see it at Ollantaytambo with a couple of the giant megalith-sized blocks. A couple of those have been propped up and moved, and they've got some smaller stones underneath them. I think this is simply just the Inca repair work. I think they put together and they fixed what they could, and because these stones only fit together in a very precise single orientation and in a single spot, in some cases they may have had to build up a little bit of foundation under these stones, and I think that's what you're looking at. I don't think they made the walls. I don't think they were capable of hauling these stones up and down the mountainside, particularly at Ollantaytambo. The quarry for the granite at Ollantaytambo is actually at the top of the mountain across the valley from it. In this picture you can actually see Graham Hancock pointing it out. But that's the quarry. They had to bring these giant sort of 100-ton plus stones all the way down, cross the river, and then bring them up this steep mountainside to the top at Ollantaytambo. And in fact, there's actually one stone that's been left halfway up the mountainside at Ollantaytambo. When they put the road in, they had to build the road around this stone. They weren't going to be able to move it. There's additional proof of renovation in the Inca walls themselves at Sacsayhuaman. I haven't found a picture of this, but I've read the reports that said that in some of the Inca walls that were built at Sacsayhuaman, so some of the repairs where they built up their walls on top of the older megalithic work, in the backfill for those walls, some of those backfills, they contained megalithic blocks, which is kind of an interesting observation when you get to thinking about it. If you are claiming that the Inca built the entire wall, so both styles, with the megalithic style and then the sort of loose rock style, why are there megalithic blocks in the backfill for that wall? If you are the one making that block, it's going to have a home, it's going to be in a wall somewhere. But if you're like the Inca likely were, if you found that site, you couldn't find where this block went, you were going to use it, you might as well use it. So they actually put it into one of their walls as backfill To me, that's pretty clear evidence that they came along and had found a bunch of megalithic stuff laying around, and they rebuilt as much of it as they could. But what they didn't rebuild, they used. And you can see this in the streets of Cusco. There are so many examples of where they've reused the megalithic blocks that they couldn't actually put back in their original location. You see megalithic blocks inserted as the lentils in doorways in Cusco. You see them put into walls. You see entire structures that have been rebuilt by using megalithic blocks, but they've been rebuilt with like cement. When the Spanish, they did the same thing. The Inca would use those megalithic blocks if they couldn't actually repair them. As we move up to the top of the hill here, stone blocks change to andesite. So it's not just limestone at Sacsayhuaman. A lot of the actual foundation work and the construction that's on top of the hill is all made of andesite. And as you can see, many of these blocks are very straight-edged. They were highly valued for quarrying. That's why there's very few of them left up here. But these andesite blocks and these straight-edged blocks, they look very similar to some of the architecture that you see in the Coricancha. And to me, they also remind me of some of the things that you will see at Pumapunku or Tiwanaku in Bolivia. As I quoted in the last video, not a house in Cusco, particularly not those built by the Spanish, isn't made from the blocks that were quarried from this site. As we go up on top of the mountain, there is a very interesting structure up here, and it's a structure that we can only see the foundations for today. Some people call it the Eye of the Puma. It has a few other names, but it's this huge circular geometric set of circular masonry. And this was once a structure that had at least 4 or 5 levels to it. This was reported by Spanish chroniclers. There's been a number of people that have reported what this structure originally was. Unfortunately, it's all fully been quarried, so we really don't know what this looks like or what this looked like originally. It's been reported that there were as many as 3 towers at the top of the hill here, so you may have had 3 circular constructions, all consisting of multiple levels of masonry, but today we just have the foundations. Pretty much everything here has been quarried, and the stone's been reused in probably half the buildings in ancient Cusco. And what's interesting is that this type of masonry is very similar to the Coricancha, and it's likely that Sacsayhuaman may have flowed all the way down the hill to the Coricancha originally as all part of one giant megalithic construction. As you can see, Cusco behind the Eye of the Puma here, down that hill is Manco Capac's palace, and there we see those megalithic walls that have masonry just like what we find at the top here, and if you keep going in that direction you'll eventually hit the Coricancha. I think it was all part of one giant original megalithic construction. As we walk up here, you see we get a better view of the Rotadero. A lot of these cellular walls on the Rotadero are quite large as well. There's multiple terraces over there. Very few people really go over and take a close look at it. But what's interesting over there is you can actually see that the level of the ground or the level of the rocks goes down into the ground, which tells you that maybe the original ground level wasn't where it is today. Either that or they deliberately built a wall that seems to be sort of heading directly into the ground. But to me, it's more likely that I think the ground level was at a different place, and what we experience on the site today is merely that's been excavated in modern times. In terms of how these walls were built, well, there's lots and lots of different opinions on that. The idea that they're all quarried and they were moved in here and shaped. The actual quarry location isn't really well known for Sacsayhuaman. Brian Forrester has a couple good videos where they were off looking at various limestone hills, because the hill here isn't limestone. These limestone blocks were definitely moved in and brought in from somewhere else. Where that exact quarry is, there's a lot of speculation. There are limestone hills within sort of 10 kilometers of this area, and some of those do have what look like quarry marks. There's no obvious quarries, but it seems likely that they were brought in from a distance, anywhere up to 10 or perhaps even further kilometers away, which is just astonishing when you're talking about loads of 150 tons or more and steep hillsides like you have in Peru, and the elevation. The geopolymer theories, it's an interesting idea. I'm yet to be fully convinced of it. I'm waiting for somebody to actually do an experiment to say, well, here's your limestone block that looks just like this, and I've made it out of geopolymer, and here's the process. I do know that there's been some work done at Bolivia and Tiwanaku, carbon found inside the andesite stones, which doesn't make any sense. some interesting investigation work going in there, and I thoroughly hope that they continue down that path to figuring it out. But as far as I know, that work hasn't really been done at Sacsayhuaman yet. It's a different type of stone. It is a slightly different form of architecture than Tiwanaku, so I hope we get there. I hope that there is an analysis done at Sacsayhuaman. But I have, in general, several kind of issues with the geopolymer idea. In either case, either it's geopolymer or it's not, you're still talking about a form of technology that the Inca did not have access to. There's certainly no accounts of the Inca ever making concrete. The Spanish were the first ones to use real concrete. There's some fundamental questions that you've got to be asked. Example, you have to cast all of those blocks. You have to make a shape with them, so you have to make a mold. You pour your slurry into the mold and it sets. If you're building a wall, why is every single block a different shape and size? That means that you have as many molds as there are blocks. Every block is unique, therefore it requires its own mold. Even if you cast your blocks, you then have to make them fit together, and that's a very difficult process. These shapes are very complex, the curved shapes that extend all the way through the rock. I think they must have been carved or shaped. Somebody had the ability to work with this stone in a fundamental way that we don't understand. I think that's perhaps the best way of putting it. And I certainly don't have the answers, but when I look at the evidence, that's really all I'm saying, is that this doesn't line up with what we know about the Incas' capability. And if they didn't do it, somebody else did. We don't know who that was, and perhaps we should be investigating this whole thing with an open mind, with that sort of possibility in mind, as opposed to just ruling it all done by the Inca and just ignoring all of the contradictions that are evident in this architecture. So as we're standing here halfway up the Rodadero, or the hillside behind the main wall of Sacsayhuaman, you can see that the extrusion, the lava extrusion, has had a lot of shapes cut into it. These shapes are pretty classic Hanan Pacha. These are the Inca thrones. This is quite famous, this little area here, but you have some very flat surfaces. Some people think these are quarrying shapes or that they're steps. It's hard to say if that's what they are. There are some really weird shapes at various sites that don't match quarrying marks. They certainly don't match steps at a lot of places. To me, it's just really random almost. You have these square shapes cut out of Hanan Pacha, but then you also have these curvature, almost liquid shapes that are carved out. Here's another part of the park that isn't often explored. It's part of the Sacsayhuaman area, but there's a really weird piece of Hanan Pacha here that almost looks as if it's been melted and flowed into place. It's a very strange set of what just looks like absolutely ancient shaped rock. As you walk around the back of the Rodadero and we get into this really old Hanan Pacha style, you see some evidence for just tremendous cataclysm and just tremendous damage. There's these big chunks of rock have been split apart at some point, and they've rolled around. So something's hit this site that's knocked things down. It's split some of these ancient stones apart and moved them around. You kind of have what you could describe as like an upside down staircase in some areas. You can clearly see where the walls have been split, and you can tell that these are worked surfaces. You'll see a lot of like straight stone walls and things like that, so you know this isn't a natural effect. But then also consider how old this looks. This stuff always seems to be just incredibly ancient, really, really eroded relative to the other megalithic work. And it's in this area that I find to be real interesting. Lots of good examples of the three different styles of architecture. You have the Hanan Pacha monolithic work, the single piece work. You have the Uran Pacha cellular megalithic work, the famous style that we see in South America. And then you see all the Inca work that's on top of that. Also here is you have some good evidence for how these stones were shifted around in the cataclysm. And this is actually strong evidence for suggesting that the Uran Pacha, the megalithic cellular work, was in place before the cataclysm happened. Because right here you've got a stone that's actually been moved in this destruction, and it's been put and rolled to where it's in front of some megalithic blocks. So it means that those blocks had to be there before the cataclysm or before the destruction happened. So you kind of get an idea for the layering. And it's one of the very, very few examples I can find where the orders don't always match up. And in this case, it seems to be pretty clear that it's because these rocks have been split and moved around. It's quite a little maze when you get into here. It's very hard to comprehend what these surfaces were for or what this site was made for, even from a ceremonial or symbolic perspective. They're very strange shapes. This part of the park really reminds me of Kenko, the way you move through these giant flat planed surfaces of stone. Here's a good example of circular protection in this small little courtyard. You can see that the Uranpacha megalithic wall has been formed in a curve in this little depressed area, and it's all centered around Hananpacha architecture, these shapes cut into these what looks like ancient bits of stone. In the back area of Sacsayhuaman, there is also what I could only really call just a giant courtyard, this giant sort of circular area. It looks like a place where you could play a pretty good game of cricket if you wanted to. And some people suggest that this was a reservoir, that it was full of water at some point. It's hard to say what it was really for. It's clear to me that these megalithic builders, they were respecting this more ancient work for some reason. They were, it's like a gentle touch almost. You see the same thing again and again in these several megalithic courtyards that are part of Sacsayhuaman. There's several of these little circular areas that have foundations of walls and some remaining blocks from walls in them. I'm not sure what the purpose is or was, but you can also see that there's really all three layers of architecture at this part of the site. I really love this area because you've got the Hananpacha, you have the Uranpacha, and then you have the Inca work, the Ikunpacha, on top, and it becomes very, very clear that there was something different going on. This is quite likely the result of three entirely different phases of occupation and building here. Two of those phases coming from quite possibly pre-cataclysmic times. Another beautiful, really small little circular depression. To me, I think of this as kind of like an Inca hot tub. This is like the the main suite of Sacsayhuaman, and this is the hot tub around the corner. But I don't know. It's just these beautiful little touches that are all over this place. You could spend a couple days here and still not discover everything it has to offer. I always enjoy going back to Sacsayhuaman. It's so easy to get to when you're in Cusco. It's just like if you have an afternoon, you might as well go up and hit the site. It's even lovely there when it rains and hails. I've had all sorts of weather on site when I've been there. There's lots of little tunnels that you can explore. There's one interesting one that you can get into. It's called the Little Chicana or Little Tunnel. It takes about a minute and a half or thereabouts to go through it. It's an interesting experience because right in the middle there, it's absolutely pitch black. There's no trace of light at all. It's a fun experience to go in there and then turn off your light. You get a sense of what it might have been like to work in these underground spaces. But the site of Sacsayhuaman itself is also supposedly home to many other tunnels. And in fact, there's reports of the government actually bricking up access to tunnel systems as far back as the 1920s because people were getting lost down there. And certainly the mythology of these tunnels persists from the Incan times. There is supposed to be a tunnel that leads from Sacsayhuaman to the center of Cusco. I think it's actually supposed to come up in the center of the Coricancha. Again, I think you're looking at architecture here that has been through at least two periods of major destruction. It's one of the nuances that you have to get used to looking at when it comes to ancient sites. Many of them have been built up by different civilizations, and then many of them have been taken apart by other civilizations or quarried. There are a lot of interesting blocks that you can see on some sites, like this block that has the snake motif in it. I'm actually quite surprised that this block is still here. I think a lot of these types of things would have been quite highly prized for quarrying. And you do see snake blocks and these types of motif blocks being used in repair work in other areas of Cusco. And then over the far back corner of the park at Sacsayhuaman, there is just this tremendous, huge stone. It's a massive piece of Hananpacha architecture. And this is I think this is a natural rock, or it may have been a chunk of a hillside that rolled down here. But you can see that there is a lot of shapes and a lot of these Inca thrones that have been carved into this block. Locally it's known as the Chincana or tunnel block, and there's an interesting legend that surrounds it. This is an Incan legend, and then they said that back in the day there was a tunnel entrance right where this rock rests now, and supposedly something happened and this rock rolled on top of that entrance, and the Inca were forced to dig their way back down through this giant piece of stone to get back to the tunnel entrance. And what's interesting is as you go around the other side of this giant piece of architecture, you can actually see that there is a staircase and a rock that's been kind of split off from the original block. It looks like a staircase that has been, perhaps an internal staircase that's been carved down towards what could be a tunnel entrance. I'm not really sure if this area is actually in the park or not. On the couple of times that I've been here, I've definitely had a couple of guides come over, or just the park guys with the little vests on and their whistles, tooting their whistles at me as if I wasn't supposed to be here. But you can see this if you go over the back area of Sacsayhuaman, and I definitely recommend going over and checking out this area. It's very interesting. I do hope you enjoyed that look at Sacsayhuaman. It's one of my favourite sites. I wanted this to be a bit more casual. I want to say a huge thank you to everybody that supports the channel. You're really making it possible for me to spend the time to make these videos, so thank you for that. And if you're interested in supporting the channel via the value for value model, you can find out all the details and the ways to do that at unchartedx.com/support. Please do check it out. Also, I just wanted to say that I'm pretty active on social media. I post a lot of pictures from a lot of ancient sites, and I give production and update news in terms of my videos. If you're interested in anything like that, please give me a follow over at Twitter or on Instagram. I even have a Discord server. You can find out the details for that on my site. Otherwise, I will see you all in the next video. Peace. Hello all, and welcome back to Uncharted X. This is Ben. This video is another video podcast that I've done with the Snake Brothers, and we were also joined by my good friend Matt Simpson from the Ancient Architects channel. I'm sure many of you know about his channel. If you somehow don't, definitely go and check it out. There's a link to that below. We are doing another kind of in-depth look at one of these sites from around the world. This time we're pivoting away from Egypt. We're going to take a look at Sacsayhuaman and Cusco over there in Peru. It's an enigmatic site. It's one of my favorite sites to visit. Cusco in general is just full of all sorts of incredible architecture that stem from all sorts of different styles, from the megalithic to the Inca to the colonial Spanish to the modern, and it's all kind of piled up on each other. It's a really good example of a city that's just been through so many different phases of building and architecture. If you are interested in a bit more detail and produced videos on these sites, I do have 2 videos that explore Sacsayhuaman and some of the architecture in Cusco specifically. Those are linked below. And then I also have a video that's a primer on the different styles of architecture that you're likely to see in South America. There are really 3 distinct styles of architecture, and they are laid out in a specific order, something that you can see quite clearly when you go down there and look at a lot of these sites. There's a link to that video also below. Just a quick update on some of the other things I'm working on. I know I've been producing a lot of podcasts lately. I have been doing a lot of recording with a lot of different people. I have a few more of those queued up, but I am also still working on those produced kind of mini documentary videos. In fact, I hope to get one out this week. It's going to be an interesting one, taking a look at what's been found beneath the Step Pyramid of Djoser in Egypt and how it relates to some of the earliest dynasties of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. I hope you enjoy the podcast.
And we are joined again. This is our third Uncharted X Brothers of the Serpent Swapcast, and we are joined also by Matt from the Ancient Architects channel. Matt, thanks for joining us on this one, man.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to having your input. So we were talking before we started.
Any remnants of paints where they could have, actually made them come to life, even if they just saw them, even if they were, they're not on purpose. They might have just saw the shapes themselves and painted them to look iconic. I don't know.
Possibly. Yeah, I don't know of any paint on this, but definitely like the Spanish.
It's quite a colourful culture, isn't it? The Inca, for example, are quite colourful. Their clothing, their textiles,
absolutely,
and the pottery as well.
There was, definitely, and I mean, Brian even thinks that some of that stuff could have been, some of their patterns in their embroidery could have been almost a written language. There's another one there. This is another. They'd call that a paw print, but some of the This is kind of up at some of the big stones, and we'll go like a full tour down the zigzag wall plus up on the other layers above it, then right up on top of the hill, and then back over behind us. But yeah, I mean,
So I have a question real quick. I've wondered this, like, are we looking at the bottom of the wall and what are they sitting on? I mean, is there a foundation? Is there foundation stones below the ground? Did they carve it into the bedrock?
It's a good question. We don't really know. I suspect they go down further, and we don't really know if this is the ground level, because you do have a lot of accounts, particularly after the Spanish arrived. You had a similar situation in Egypt.
Oh, nice.
It was at one point, I think one of the
when you
accounts
travel,
describes
nice.
It was the work of all
Out
of
there,
the town
yeah,
to be
for sure,
digging
man.
here. Like, the
Dude,
people
that
were
city's so
digging
nice.
and excavating and changing everything. So even this layer that we look at today and we walk on, I think that's still, that may not be the same layer that it was in the past. You actually, in some places where we'll get up to, you'll see big stones underneath these stones as well. So it's
I
possible.
saw that on like a little bit earlier on the other video. There were a few you could see them sitting on something.
Yeah.
I just couldn't tell if it was bedrock outcrops or if it was stones that went further down.
I don't know. I mean, I think it was first excavated or fully excavated in 1944. It was a guy called John Howland Rowe who excavated the site quite extensively, and there's one of those Puma Horse again.
Yep.
And so I'm trying to get hold of that report that he wrote to find out exactly.
All right, one sec. Let me.
I'll be back. Accounts from the excavations, because that seems to have gone from everywhere. I can't seem to find that anywhere. I think written such a long time ago, probably buried in a university library.
Yeah, and that's probably something worth mentioning about this whole site is that in general in South America, there's way less information about this stuff than you would typically find, say, for Egypt, for example. You've got, obviously no written records from the Inca and previous civilizations. Anything that was more or less destroyed. You've got a few accounts from the conquistadors and some of the priests and the as they mixed with the local culture here, and they. I think Clarence Markham and there's a few other people that have got some accounts written down, Garcilaso de la Vega, but very little information in general about this stuff. And it's one of those things, like the Inca don't really ever claim to have built these things, even though we attribute it to them. It's pretty clear as we go around that there's a lot more going on. Than just the Inca.
So is this limestone, and do they know where the quarry is?
It is limestone, I believe. The quarry is, I have heard conflicting reports on it. Brian tells me that the quarry is within, it's like 15 kilometers away. There's quite a distance, the quarry. And what's impressive about that is, you're talking about the Andes mountain range here, right? This is 11,500 feet at Cusco. You're way up in the steep mountains, up in high altitude.
And easy terrain.
Right. And it's almost a distinction between, this is a good example, if your top left corner here, you probably see a lot of this as well, also in these gaps here. This is one of the big tellers.
I am almost done though, buddy.
We could talk about this.
I am almost done. I'm going to do one more bicep curls and then one more bench press, and then I'll probably be done.
Or it's limestone or something. The megalithic work tends to all be of the same, whatever installation it is, it's of the same stone type.
Oh, thanks, man.
That seems to be really important, and in most cases that stone has come from a significant distance. I know there's some granite work in the city, in Cusco. The quarry's like 30 kilometers away, so they've hauled this stone a long distance over the mountains. And that's juxtaposed with the small repair work that you see on and around this stuff, always on top of it, which means it came later. That is typically andesite, and it's local stone. It's the stuff that they find right in this area. It's rougher work, it's smaller work. Now I think it's the Inca. That's the sign of the Inca. The Inca found this. They found Cusco. They found these sites when that empire emerged, and they came down out of the highlands They followed the river, and they found Cusco. I think it was probably an abandoned megalithic city.
All right, one more bench press and then one more bicep curl, and then I'm gonna sign off. Thanks, buddy. Thanks for being here, man.
They used the stone that was laying around. You see. When we get down in the city, there's tremendous examples of where they would reuse megalithic stone in their buildings, in their works. Quite commonly, you'd see lintels, stones above doorways. That's like a big basalt stone that's shoved in somewhere, and the rest of the wall's just andesite. So they would reuse the stuff that was laying around. They'd repair what they could, but in general, it's I think they found it profound and they respected it, and that became a big part of their culture.
Is that another there on the upper left?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the age of these stones will be, you can get an idea from the rock type. Once we know the exact rock type, so if I was up close there now and analysing what rocks they are, because we can see the scoop marks in them, because we can still see
nice. All right, one more
work
bicycle.
surfaces. If it's limestone, it might not be that old, because we can still see these tool marks. But if it's granite or if it's a harder stone, then it could be, or any age really. So I think sort of a geological analysis of the rock type might be the one thing that can help us date it, roughly, whether it's 2,000, 1,000, 10,000, 5,000 years old.
Yeah.
It's that sort of scientific work that needs doing on the site, a full geological analysis of the rocks. But even then, they could have been reworked. We don't know.
Yeah. You'd also have to take into account the climate history of the area and whether or not it was buried too, right?
Well, that's yeah. Obviously, the soil does move. I mean, and I was reading a paper quite recently saying that the people who built these sites built different walls for different purposes. So these walls, they were saying, might be so massive because they were trying to hold back as much soil as possible to stop it moving.
Big retaining walls.
So it needed to be stronger than in Cusco, for example. I don't know if that's correct or not, but it's somebody's theory is they're trying to hold back all this soil from creeping down the hill, so they built these giant walls around it. Well, again, it's a theory, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. This is just to explain. This bit of footage is, so we started off. That was we'll come back to that the other end, which is I guess the left side, looking at the zigzag wall. This is far down the right hand side at the other end of the zigzag wall, and I like this footage because you can see a similar thing like that where it's almost, it's not really serving as a retaining wall here. You've got you've got like the soil on top of the wall. And I think this is maybe an indication, could be an indication of age. It's either where it's been excavated or carved or cleared. But all that dirt, you can see all the pieces from these walls have been removed. A lot of this has been quarried. I think these walls were generally quite a bit taller. But there are like a number of courses of this wall as it goes up the hill. It is almost like a series of, like a walled garden. You know, it creates those flat spaces.
Yeah, it's terraces.
It is terracing. That's right, yeah,
I'm
terracing.
surprised those terraces haven't crumbled with the stones have removed. Yeah, they would have crumbled, and you know.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other thing that is, we'll get a better look at this as we go around there. So, some of these walls, like where the ground level's lower behind them, they would create these walls, and then it looks like they would, the Inca at least would backfill the
Thanks,
walls.
buddy.
with
Thanks for being here,
material.
man. Thanks for being here,
What's
Shazad.
interesting is that behind some of these stones and the other walls,
Tylosaurus and Jamie and everyone.
So
yo, thanks for
it's
that.
kind of
Thanks
an
for being here,
interesting,
man.
like, how did a megalithic block get in? It's just thrown in there.
Nice
as
to
well,
catch up,
like,
man.
Someone
I do
made
have to
those
go
walls, or
now,
someone-
though, but
maybe it was used as a retaining wall.
really
later.
nice
I
catching
don't
up,
know.
man.
But when you see, like, in a
Hope to
backfill,
catch up
like,
with you
oh,
soon again, you know.
they've taken a stone
I
that
followed
they
you,
found
so if
and
you
they've
do
used
start
it as
streaming, or when you
material
do,
in
I'll
backfill.
be there
Pretty
watching.
clear indication to me that it was a repair. Like, they were backfilling.
Let me
these
know if
walls
you need
as
any
part of the
like
repair process
setup
and
help,
using blocks
like with
that
using
had
OBS or
fallen
whatever,
off the walls and
OBS
they found
Studio
some
or
rust.
whatever.
Maybe they couldn't find where it originally went. So to me, it's like you wouldn't do that if that was the original building. You know, if you built this site originally,
Yo, thanks
you wouldn't,
Shazad. Thanks for being here, man. You're the
you
man,
wouldn't
dude.
just backfill with a shaped block. You know that you went to.
Yo,
the trouble of
cool,
shaping
nice,
something
nice,
like that.
man.
That's
Nice,
the
buddy.
point.
Rubble you'd used, bits of stone that you find on the
Nice.
ground. But it's just mind-boggling. The whole thing is
Sweet, man. Thanks, buddy.
mind-boggling.
Thanks
I
for being here,
can't
man.
figure
It's cool.
out- Some people don't.
I'm guessing
see
you're living in
it as
Toronto
dangerous. Some
still,
say
Mississauga.
a complete ceremonial site.
That's cool, man.
Apparently, it wasn't a settlement. It's like
I've got a lot to catch up on. I have so many
I
questions.
don't know. The whole thing is
Like,
the lack of
how's
written
like
record
his,
is a real problem, isn't it? No one really knows.
you know,
Yeah,
want to know more about your wife and your family. If you have a family, if you hope your mom's good, hope your dad's okay. I hope everyone's great. Hope everyone's doing well.
What they were told to,
And Markham, oh, nice, man. That's sick.
I think it's because,
Yeah.
It's a cool spot. It's a nice spot.
It's the whole the colonial imperative of superiority, right? I mean, there's and how much it comes down to it. A similar thing happened in North American
That's a cool
culture
spot.
with. I was talking to Hugh Newman the other day.
We're all good, nice. No kids yet? Oh, nice, no worries, bud. Thanks, man. Yeah, that was on my mind, not gonna lie. I was wondering that.
Was because
That's cool, man.
there was an imperative to be superior, like the colonial imperative of the white man, all that sort of stuff at that time was one of the reasons why they would sort of hide some
Awesome,
of that,
man.
anything that suggested, these people were bigger and stronger than we are, or something like that. And it's just a similar thing that could have happened
Okay.
in the history.
Okay,
And
great.
as you say, it's just a big mystery. We don't know. It's an Inca.
I guess
you
let's
hear
see-
very
let's see if
conflicting stories
someone's
about what
online.
the Inca said about this.
There's probably a
some
lot of people playing
they say
GoldenEye.
that,
Let's
you
see.
know, it appeared overnight.
If I don't know any of them, I'm not going to read them. But if I do,
Here,
Romique.
but there's really nowhere where they claim to have built it. Now there are some accounts from the Spanish. I think Garcilaso de la Vega is one of them, where he did witness the Inca trying to move large stones.
Sure, let's
they
read.
would-
Wait,
the-
let's see.
Really zero technology involved
Romique.
in this. They were just using ropes and manpower.
Yeah, we'll
no
read
crews, no
Romique.
levers. And I think
Why
what
not?
he was witnessing was their ongoing efforts to repair and restore these places. Because there's other legends like the legend of the lazy stone that fell down the hill. We'll get to that when we actually get to that stone.
The amount of people as well, the amount of people you need to get this done, because
Okay, man.
I think what this video
Thanks,
showed
buddy.
me
Thanks
is
for
the
being here, man.
scale. It's huge, isn't it?
There
It's
will be
absolutely
more
huge.
streams, more
Yeah,
time to
I-
hang out
I
and talk.
suspect it's a fraction of what.
Not
was.
this weekend though. I'm going to be gone this
Yeah,
week. I'm going to
because
be
it-
traveling this
destroyed
weekend.
by
But
the Spanish to an extent.
okay.
It was
It's also
Thanks,
interesting
buddy.
because that the appearing
See you later.
overnight legend that recurs in so many sites. I mean, there's the legend about a Baalbek, for example, that Cain built it in a fit of rage in one night, and then Nan Maydal, the same thing. The two brothers in one night floated all the stones over and built that place. It's a kind of a similar theme.
It is.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it is. The whole Shamir thing that
Right,
you guys
yeah.
were explaining to me. So this is interesting. So this. I wanted to pause here and just briefly mention this
Yeah.
because most people are familiar with that puff